An 8-year-old girl's simple question silenced a crowded town hall and led Donald Trump to share a deeply personal story about faith, loss, and redemption. What happened next moved the entire room to tears. The Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, buzzed softly with the sound of folding chairs scraping against the polished floor and the low hum of murmured conversations. Normally, this space was reserved for Sunday potlucks and Bible studies, but tonight, it had taken on a more serious and curious atmosphere. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump, his unmistakable presence filling the modest hall. His orange-tinted complexion, his signature hand gestures. Everything about him was familiar to everyone in the room. But tonight, he seemed different. He was uncharacteristically subdued, as though he sensed the gravity of the event. The audience was a mix of families, retirees, and local residents, most of whom had come out of curiosity to hear what he had to say. People shuffled in their seats, some adjusting their jackets, others whispering to the person beside them. But in the middle of the crowd, there was one figure who stood out, not because of her size, but because of her quiet intensity. 8-year-old Lily sat near the center of the room, dressed in her best Sunday dress, her hair carefully combed into neat braids. She clutched an old leather-bound Bible tightly to her chest. It wasn't just any Bible. It was a family heirloom, passed down from her late grandmother. Its pages were worn, its edges frayed, and the gold lettering on the cover was faded with time. To Lily, it was a treasure. Her mother, seated beside her, had leaned down earlier in the car and whispered, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough, and only if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded silently, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, scribbling and rewriting her question in the back of her notebook during recess, whispering it to herself in bed at night. It wasn't a question of simple curiosity. It was something deeper, something heavier, a question that had settled in her soul and refused to leave. As the evening progressed, Trump spoke about his usual topics: policies, achievements, and the future of America. Occasionally, the crowd would clap or nod in agreement, but the energy in the room wasn't the fiery kind seen at his rallies. It was quieter, more restrained. Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible tighter with every passing minute. Her heart felt like it might burst out of her chest. Finally, the moment came. The floor opened for questions. A line quickly formed, filled with adults eager to step forward. They asked about local issues, national policies, and even a few lighthearted questions about his iconic red tie. The room's energy picked up slightly, people smiling and nodding as they listened. But Lily stayed in her seat, frozen. Her hands trembled slightly, and her grip on her Bible tightened even more. Her mother leaned over and gave her a gentle nudge, whispering, "Now's your chance." With a deep breath, Lily stood, her legs feeling shaky and uncertain beneath her. The line of adults seemed so long and daunting, but she moved forward anyway. Each step felt heavier than the last. The room began to notice her, a small girl with a large Bible clutched against her chest. Conversations died down, heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. When her turn finally came, she stood at the microphone. She had to tilt her head back to look up at the man towering above her. Trump's expression softened as he looked at her. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Lily's hands trembled as she gripped her Bible. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and for a brief moment, she thought she might not be able to do it. But then, she remembered her grandmother's voice telling her to be brave. She took another deep breath and spoke. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" Her voice trembled slightly, but it didn't break. The room fell into an immediate and absolute silence. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Eyes darted between Lily and Trump, the weight of her question hanging heavy over everyone. For a man known for his quick comebacks and rapid-fire answers, Trump didn't respond right away. He looked at Lily, then at the Bible she held so tightly to her chest. Something in his demeanor shifted. His usual bravado seemed to melt away, replaced by an expression that was softer, almost vulnerable. The silence in the room was deafening. People leaned forward in their seats, holding their breath, waiting. Trump's gaze lingered on the little girl for a long moment, and then his eyes drifted back to the Bible. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Lily shifted slightly, her small frame seeming even smaller under the weight of the room's collective gaze. Her question had not been meant to challenge him or put him on the spot. It wasn't political. It wasn't a trap. It was honest, sincere, and deeply personal, born out of a child's longing to understand something bigger than herself. Somehow, that sincerity was louder and more impactful than any speech or policy debate. The crowd remained still, almost holding its collective breath, as they watched Trump wrestle with the question. For the first time that night, he wasn't the larger-than-life figure everyone had expected. He was just a man, standing in front of a little girl, trying to find the right words to answer a question that transcended politics. Even the faint creaking of chairs or the muffled coughs in the room seemed to vanish, as though the very air itself was holding its breath. Trump finally raised his hand slightly, almost as if to steady himself, and leaned against the podium. The weight of the moment was palpable. "That's a big question," he began, his voice lower, steadier than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The admission stunned the crowd. Trump, a figure known for his unshakable confidence, was confessing uncertainty in front of everyone. For a moment, the man behind the persona was visible, human, vulnerable, honest. He glanced back at Lily, the young girl whose question had sparked this moment. His expression shifted to something gentler, almost paternal. "When I was about your age," he continued, his tone softening, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents used to take me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those wooden pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." He paused again, this time casting a thoughtful look across the audience, as though searching their faces for understanding. His hand rested on the edge of the podium, his fingers tapping lightly against the smooth wood. "My father used to tell me," he said after a moment, "that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time. Sometimes you're afraid you'll fall. Sometimes the next step feels too far away. But you keep climbing, because there's something up there worth reaching for." He hesitated, a faint, almost self-deprecating smile touching his face. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room, breaking the tension slightly. But Lily didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. Her eyes stayed locked on him, unwavering, as though she were still waiting for the real answer her young heart was desperate to hear. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to an even softer tone. "As I got older," he said, "life threw a lot of challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going. And in those times," he paused, the room utterly silent. "In those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he'd given up on me altogether." The audience seemed to hold their collective breath. This wasn't the polished rhetoric or rehearsed sound bites they were used to. This was something different, something raw, something real. "But I'll tell you this," Trump continued, his voice firming up slightly as he straightened. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was completely alone, I realized something important. Faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that even when you can't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work." He glanced back at Lily. Her small hands still gripped her grandmother's Bible, but her hold had loosened just a little. Her wide eyes glistened under the fluorescent lights. "And God, to me," he said, his words slow and deliberate, "is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not finished. He's the one who keeps telling us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break beneath us." For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air. Then, Lily's eyes filled with tears. At first, just a single drop slid down her cheek, glinting like crystal in the light as she clutched the Bible tighter against her chest. The crowd began to murmur softly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Her shoulders started to tremble, and the whispers in the room grew louder. But still, no one dared interrupt the moment. Her mother leaned over instinctively, placing a comforting hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice tender. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. It was something far deeper, something she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Trump's words had reached a place in her heart that had been locked away, a place she hadn't dared open before. Trump seemed to notice her reaction. His gaze softened, and for a moment, it was as if the rest of the room disappeared. All that remained was the unspoken connection between the man at the podium and the girl clutching her grandmother's Bible. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but gentle. "God doesn't leave us," he said, "even when it feels like the world is falling apart, even when we feel like we're not enough. He's there, and he's always reminding us to keep climbing." Lily's tears came faster now, and the tension in the room seemed to dissolve, replaced by an almost sacred stillness. One by one, the murmurs quieted, as though the audience collectively understood they were witnessing something beyond words. Lily's mother leaned closer, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shaking shoulders, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. And though the moment was deeply personal, it resonated with everyone present. Trump had answered not just Lily's question, but a question many in the audience had carried in their own hearts. It was a reminder of something simple yet profound, that faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting in the climb, even when the steps ahead are hidden in shadow. As he stepped away from the podium, his expression was uncharacteristically subdued. His usual air of confidence was replaced by something quieter, almost reflective. "What's your name?" he asked gently, his tone soft but steady. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely audible, little more than a whisper. "That's a beautiful name," he replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest ones to answer, and sometimes those questions remind us of what really matters." Lily nodded slowly, her wide, tear-filled eyes never leaving his face. "My grandma used to say that too," she said softly. "She always told me, God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." At that, his expression flickered, just for a moment. It wasn't something anyone could easily describe, a mixture of admiration, understanding, and something deeper, unspoken. He took a deep breath and shifted his gaze back to the crowd. "You know, This little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask, he began, his voice carrying a newfound weight. What does God mean to us? It's not an easy question, is it? It forces us to look inward. It makes us face things we don't like to face. Our fears, our doubts, our flaws. The room fell into an almost sacred silence. His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. In that moment, it felt as though Lily wasn't just a little girl clutching a Bible. She was something much bigger. She was a symbol, a reminder. Her small act of courage had transformed the atmosphere entirely. What had started as a routine gathering now felt like something far more profound, a collective reflection on faith, life, and humanity. Trump continued, his voice softer now but steady. We live in a world, he said, where we're constantly searching for answers outside of ourselves. We think power, success, money. We think these things will fill the gaps inside us. But they don't. They never do. He paused, letting the silence emphasize his words. The real answers, he said, are the ones that make us uncomfortable. The ones that force us to ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking? His gaze drifted back to Lily, and something in his tone shifted. It was gentler now, yet filled with unmistakable sincerity. Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily, he said softly. You're wiser than most adults I've ever met. The crowd erupted into quiet applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it carried a deep sense of appreciation. Yet, Lily seemed oblivious to the noise around her. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a look of quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress and glanced up at her mother, who was smiling at her with glistening eyes of her own. But as the applause subsided, Trump's demeanor shifted again. The room could sense it. The conversation wasn't over. It felt as though they were all being drawn deeper into his story, into something personal, something raw. The air grew impossibly still. Even the shuffling of feet and the rustle of clothing seemed to disappear. Trump shifted slightly at the podium, scanning the crowd, before resting his gaze back on Lily. There was a heaviness in his expression, a weight that seemed to come from somewhere beyond politics or public life. When I was a young man, he began, his voice softer now. There was a time I thought I had it all figured out. I had ambition. I had plans. I had the drive to succeed. He paused, his eyes dropping to the floor for a moment. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had. He let the words hang in the air. The room leaned in, as though drawn by an invisible force. Everyone was waiting, breathless. Trump rarely opened up about his personal life, and now it seemed like he was about to reveal something deeply intimate. My brother Fred, he said finally, his voice quieter now, was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had this light about him, a goodness I couldn't quite understand at the time. He paused, his gaze distant, as if reaching into the depths of his memory. But Fred struggled, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice faltered for a moment, and he cleared his throat. When he passed away, I was angry, he admitted, his words raw and unfiltered. Angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon. The room was utterly captivated. No one moved. No one spoke. Lily's gaze never wavered, her young face etched with an expression far too wise for her age. Around the room, others wore similar expressions. Something about his words, His tone had struck a chord deep within everyone there. It was no longer just his story. It was their story too. A shared struggle, a shared grief, a shared yearning for meaning. Their expressions were a mix of empathy and intrigue, lingering long after the words were spoken. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room, as though time itself had paused. Then, with a steady but somber tone, Trump continued, his voice carrying the weight of a confession. "I turned away from God," he admitted, his eyes briefly scanning the faces before him. "I thought, if he was real, why would he let that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind?" His voice wavered, and he exhaled deeply, gripping the edge of the podium as if to steady himself. The room seemed to hold its breath, the atmosphere thick with unspoken emotion. But then, something changed, he said after a pause, his gaze distant as if lost in the memory. "I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face in my mind. He was smiling, this big, goofy smile he used to have, and I heard him say, 'Don't be angry, don't give up, you've got work to do.'" His voice cracked slightly, but his resolve grew stronger. The crowd remained silent, every ear attuned to his words. The weight of what he said pressed on them like a physical presence. Even the faint hum of cars passing outside seemed to vanish, leaving only his voice and the collective sound of hearts beating in unison. "I realized then," he continued, his voice steadying, as if the act of speaking aloud was solidifying his conviction, "that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that." He turned back to Lily, his expression softening. Her question lingered in the air, but now it felt heavier with meaning. "So when you ask me what God means to me," he said gently, "I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times." Lily's eyes shimmered again, her emotions raw, but now tinged with a sense of peace. This time, her tears didn't fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, clutching her grandmother's Bible with both hands, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. The moment felt sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath in reverence. But just as the room seemed to settle into the gravity of his story, someone in the audience raised their hand, breaking the silence and drawing all attention toward the back of the hall. A man stood slowly, his hand still raised. His rugged face, lined with years of hard work, bore a serious expression. He looked like someone you might pass on the street without a second thought. A mechanic, a father, perhaps someone who attended church sporadically when life allowed it. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was anything but ordinary. "Mr. Trump," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder, do you think all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling? Could that be part of the problem?" The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, catching Trump off guard for just a moment. He leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze locking with the man's, as if searching for the right response. Finally, he spoke, his tone thoughtful and deliberate. "You know," he began, "I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded slowly, his expression softening as he sank back into his seat. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, voices low but filled with understanding. The tension in the room seemed to ease, replaced by a sense of shared vulnerability. It was Lily's voice that broke through next, her words small yet clear, carrying the wisdom of someone far older than her years. "My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds," she said, her voice steady despite her small frame. "You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." Trump smiled at her, a genuine, almost tender expression that seemed to transform his usually guarded demeanor. "Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman," he said warmly. "And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see." The room seemed to come alive with a renewed energy. People began to nod, to share glances, and even to whisper quietly to those sitting beside them. What had started as a structured town hall had shifted into something far more personal, a shared reflection on life's challenges, doubts, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, raised her hand next. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words carried a quiet strength. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been angry at God ever since. I couldn't understand why he would take him from me. But hearing all of this tonight, I think maybe I've been looking at it the wrong way." Her admission seemed to resonate deeply with the crowd. For a moment, there was silence again, but this time, it was filled with a sense of collective healing. Trump nodded, his expression compassionate. "Anger is a part of grief," he said softly, "and so is questioning God. But faith doesn't mean never doubting. It means finding a way to trust, even when it's hard." The woman nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. Around her, others murmured in agreement, their faces reflecting the emotional journey they had all been on together. The evening had turned into something none of them had expected, a space where vulnerability was met with understanding and where doubt was met with hope.